Hi, so I'm going to make a quick video talking particularly about book covers because I've been talking to several of my students about their book covers, and I'm always suggesting to have a professional designer, book cover designer, to actually make your book cover rather than doing it yourself, especially in the beginning. So I wanted to kind of help you get an idea of why, especially beginner self-publishers, when they tend to create their own cover or they think they, have an idea for a cover, it might not be a good idea because, first of all, there's a lot that goes into creating a cover, particularly when it comes to your niche, when it comes to the general principles of a cover, how to make it really stand out. Because if your cover is not absolutely amazing, it just really lessens your chances to get sales. That is the first thing that people see by the cover and how it looks. So I actually typed in how to knit for beginners book, but these are also sponsored. So using my book theme plugin, we can also see how well these books are selling by looking at their BSR. So what makes these books successful book covers? Well, one thing that I do notice and I do know is that there are certain fonts. I'm not saying there's a limited number of fonts for use for the titles, but there are certain fonts that can be used for titles and certain fonts that just should never be used for titles, should never be used on a book. And most of the fonts that are used in successful book covers, like this one, you will find it repeated in other successful book covers. It might not even be the exact same font, but it will be relatively close. They're always bold. They're always easy to read. You don't have a hard time understanding what it is. Now, this one, for example, I think this is a great book cover. The title takes up a huge chunk of the space of this cover. So you know that this is the real subject of what it's about. It's about knitting. Vogue might be kind of like an addition to it, but it's basically about knitting. And there's only two colors being used, the white and this light blue. And then you have the Ultimate Knitting Book, which is not as important. So it's like a subtitle. That's why it's smaller. So obviously the size is your title and your subtitle. There has to be a difference in size so that we know what is actually important. Other text that's not important is also going to be a lot smaller, like completely revised and updated. That's not very important, but it's nice to have. They have a very specific color scheme here, the different shades of blue, but they make it work really well. The nice thing about this is there's different shades of blue yarn, but the background is also a very close shade of bluish gray. Even though the text is on top of this image, the background doesn't grab all of our attention. We see it, we know it's about yarn and knitting, and that's a subject matter, but it still blends away into the background because it's not grabbing all of our attention. Now, this one, I think it might be the same. Yeah, it's the same Vogue knitting magazine. I'm not sure. I think this is a magazine. But again, they are using the color scheme. They used a different type of sizing for their text, for their title. The subtitle is a bit bigger and it's closer to size to the title, but it still works. I wouldn't have it so close to the edge, actually. That's another mistake I do see people make. It's too close to the edge, but it has a nice color scheme and there's a high contrast, more of a higher contrast than this, I would say. But of course, if you're going to use this color, I think the light text would probably be best with it. And here it's more contrast where you can see this stands out, which works better because the text is also smaller. So you could get away with lesser contrast if the text is huge. Now, let's look. This is an example of font I would not use in the title. It's just not that easy to read, especially from far away, and especially if you were, say, on a phone and looking at the thumbnails. It's not professional quality type of font that you could use in a cover. So that makes me feel like this is definitely, well, it's definitely self-published, but it's not a very professional cover. Most of these are actually either really good or they are decent. This one is not too bad. I can tell that this is not a very professional cover, but I mean, I guess you could get away with it. This might be a hard niche to get into. So I do see a lot of book covers that are really good, but they're not selling very well. So it has a lot more to do with the marketing as well. So let's go and look at examples of something that is not a good book cover. I did see some that I did not think was very professional. This one definitely could use a lot of work. This one, the text does not stand out. It could be a lot larger, especially since there's all this space and there's nothing in it. There's nothing in the background. So I would make the text a lot larger. Also, I know it's narrowed down for left-handed people, but I would still put how to crochet a lot larger, maybe how to, and then crochet maybe on 3 lines, or maybe how to, and then crochet on the second line. I would just make it a lot larger. I'd probably make it all caps also, or just some kind of a bold font. And then also this is just way too small and can't stand out. So with this type of background, the color background, I would probably make the text white. That way it could really pop. And maybe I would choose actually even a different image, because it just doesn't look very professional, probably because of the background itself. It's not like this one where you have a feeling of the atmosphere. It has this kind of rustic type of atmosphere with the color scheme of the yarn. I mean, it gives it a more aesthetic look. Of course, with this one, I would definitely change the font probably and make it a lot larger, but overall, this one is a lot better than this one. This one would need a lot of work. So this is an example of a very unprofessional cover. Now, another thing also to consider, I'm looking at how to knit books. There are principles that will apply to these books that also might not apply to other niches. Like when I'm looking at this, cast on, bind off, I'm not even sure what that is, 54 step-by-step methods. I guess it has to do with knitting. Obviously, the only reason I know it has to do with knitting is because of all these yarns, this yarn pattern. So, but because of the aesthetic of this, I would say, because we're dealing with knitting and with yarn, I would say if I were to make a cover, to have a very nice color scheme, an attractive color scheme, like a color scheme of something maybe you would like to wear, or of a blanket you would like to have. So a very attractive color scheme, maybe very colorful. Like definitely for this type of niche, I would not make something with only one color or no color, or like this one. I would not make it without a color. I would choose something like this. This is really cool. All these different colors and patterns, because that is the subject of this particular niche. It's about knitting, and knitting is about colors and yarn and choices of colors, just like this one again, and this one, really pretty, just really bright, vibrant colors. So with this particular niche, the colors and the color scheme is very important. And that could apply to a lot of other kinds of niches, like coloring books or things for teenagers, or children's books, or, that type of thing where colors are important and the types of colors are also important. Like this one, this is very interesting. It has no picture of yarn. So this person also could be using different marketing strategies outside of Amazon to be getting their sales. So don't always look at a cover that is doing really well and try to imitate it, because you don't know where they're actually getting their sales from. Well, here's an example. They did use an image of yarn, but it's not very colorful. And then also this box shape makes it look very, very unprofessional. The word knitting is not even centered on the box, and it's part of it is on the dark blue background and part of it is on the light blue background. So it kind of makes it hard to read. It just makes the whole thing really look very unprofessional. And this part right here where there's text, it has to be centered. So unless you're going to, it's part of your design element where you have things on the side, like you have text and then maybe more text here on this side, so that your eye moves from one corner or one side to the other. If that's part of the design, which it could be, then that's okay. But this is obviously not part of the design. So when it's not centered, generally everything should be centered, then it looks very, very unprofessional. So that's another thing. Your text usually has to be centered. If it's not centered, then it's intentional and it's part of the design, where you might have a little bit of text here and say maybe the subtitle here, but it has to also go with the image. So that's something usually a professional designer would be able to do. Now, this is definitely an example of a very, very unprofessional cover. The type of font that is used, definitely, if you come across this font, don't ever use this in a book cover, like ever. How to knit a baby blanket. Okay, obviously, first of all, this is for baby blankets. I would definitely use a totally different color scheme, maybe more pastel type colors. And but also colorful and definitely a different font. And I also would not use the box. The same idea, this whole box image. Like I just got an image, I just plopped it on to this cover, and then I just put my cover together. It just makes it really unprofessional. Just the spacing between the text, you just can't have all this space for no reason. I would rather you make the text large, but have space around it, but have them closer together, but not have text, first of all, with this type of font, and then just leave all this space around it. And there's just so much space. There's just nothing going on. There's no, even if it's a subtle design, there's no subtle design. This is another example of a very unprofessional cover, how to crochet a granny square for beginners. But again, very bad font to use for title. They're just, I wish I could just have a list of fonts and just say, don't use these fonts for titles. They just don't work. Again, there's just too much space. If I'm going to leave all of this space with nothing, I would at least make my title the artwork itself. Like the title would be very large, very bold. It would be an artwork in its own. And that's one issue. And the other issue is, of course, there is a high contrast. I can't say there's not a high contrast, but because, you know, this is pink and the background is pink, and then the text is also, it's like a darker version. It's like red. There's no variation in color. Like I would want it to be a contrasting color, like maybe black or maybe a dark blue or purple, but something that would really stand out. And of course, it would stand out more if it had a nice bold text design for this, not this font. The design itself, I guess it's okay. It looks like it was cropped off. It looks like it was actually an image, but the image is not full, like it's cropped off. So that alone makes it very unprofessional. This one, definitely, if it's a children's book, it's also not a very good illustration, and it's a very poor cover. Now here's a cover that this is not selling at all. I can't say that it doesn't work, but I like the idea because it has a very clear color scheme, kind of like that blue one that we saw. The only problem is, first of all, this is about dyeing the yarn. But the only problem is you can't read it. I mean, you could read the dyeing part, but you can't read this to spin and knit, and then definitely cannot read this. I think what would make this a little bit better, I think the reason they're not selling is because it was published 7 years ago, and they're probably not doing anything to market it. What I would do is probably blur the image a little bit so that it doesn't take all the focus, because it still takes such a strong focus away from the title, especially because of these darks and the high contrast, and because there's so much detail here. This title text is not that large compared to the space that the yarn is taking up on the cover. If this text was larger, maybe like put here and a lot larger, taking up a lot more space, maybe I would make this all capital, and maybe I'd make this all capital on one line and then put to spin and knit underneath it. So it takes up more space and it's larger and easier to read. And maybe I would blur the background a little bit so it could stand out. So that might make it work. And also I would try to find a way to lighten it so it's not so extremely dark. Here's two covers that are very unprofessional. This one, everything is wrong about it. The title, the use of the colors for the text, the font being used, never use that font. I can't even read it. You can't even read this. The color with the background color is extremely boring and does not attract at all. And the image is not all that great. I'm not trying to be mean, but it's a very, very, very unprofessional cover. It looks like somebody just opened up a Canva template or something and just, actually Canva templates have much nicer templates than this. But anyways, this is definitely an example of a very poorly done cover. And this one as well, of course, I'm actually amazed that this is at 582,000. Like I would think it would be something like 2.4 million. I'd have to look at this to know what the title is, because you cannot see the title. Never put an image, like a square or rectangle image, and just plop it onto your cover. It just looks very unprofessional. Like the image choice is very poor, and the position of it is not, it just doesn't work on book covers generally. Like either it has to fade into it or it just takes up the whole cover. And if it takes up the whole cover, you really have to be very selective about what image you're using. Over time, you will get a better understanding. I would say continue to look at your competition, continue to look at those that are selling well, continue to learn what makes a good cover. You start to develop an eye for good covers over time, and you will understand and know if your cover is well done or not. And if you outsource it and have a designer design it for you. Also, you'll be able to tell if their work is professional or not. I hope that helps, and I will see you in the next video.